Today on Detroit Muscle, we're gonna bring back a project you've all been screaming to see. It's the return of our '69 Olds Cutlass Resto Mod. And today we're gonna straighten this baby out by perfecting all the panel gaps, plus a look at a gnarly 442.
It's overdue for a comeback, and here it is. Our Resto Mod Oldsmobile. Now this thing has come a long way since it left the launching pad and still got a long way to go, obviously. However, since it's been away for a while, what do you say we take a look at some of the massive metalwork and fabrication it's seen so far? It all started with a hunt for a '69 Olds Cutlass, and we found one in Louisville that could use some love and attention. It was a running, driving car, but the plans for this bad boy were way beyond where it was when we found it.
After a quick teardown, the body went onto a rotisserie, and then we took it to the blaster. They scoured off decades of grime and a whole bunch of old paint. Then we had it primer powder coated to keep the metal in good shape.
That trip to the blaster revealed some less than savory previous repairs, which had to be dealt with, starting with fixing the tops of the quarters.
We got our hands on an Art Morrison Enterprises GT chassis for the project, in addition to a big bad LSX 454 power plant to move all that metal. Since we didn't have wheels yet, we made a wooden set to make our chassis a roller. Then we were ready to stick it under the body.
Then the custom mods began, starting with flush mounts for the front and rear windows. Then the drip rails got deleted for a cleaner, more modern look. Next up, a custom spoiler for the rear deck lid fabricated out of steel from scratch. Then we took a trip to Greening Auto and they cranked out a custom set of CNC aluminum wheels, which take the original Olds design to a whole new level.
Once those were wrapped in rubber, we had to make room for the wider footprint by mini-tubbing the back wheel wells. While that was going on, down the hall they were putting our Carbon XR intake on the LSX and pulled over 600 ponies out of it on the dyno.
We poked a hole in our new aluminum fuel cell, dropped in a baffle, and installed a 90 PSI fuel pump with 1,300 horsepower capacity.
Using a mock-up motor and the skillful, helpful hands of Brad Starks, we created a clean, custom firewall. After ample amounts of welding, cutting, and grinding, the one-off firewall was finished. Then we took more sheet metal pieces, cut them, bent them, and then TIG welded them to make a custom pair of inner fenders.
The Olds got a flashy but functional drive assembly with all the accessories before we fabbed up a support system for the radiator.
We had to fill numerous trim holes in the body and showed you several ways to do the job. The brakes we went with are no joke. They'll ensure that we can stop whenever we need to. 6-piston Wilwoods all the way around.
Next order of business, steering. For that, we stepped up to an ididit column with built-in keyless ignition. After poking a hole in our firewall, we used a factory bracket for mounting.
So as you can see, our Olds looks a lot different because it's had a whole lot of work put into it. And there's still more to go. So we need to go ahead and put in our doors and our fenders because we need to adjust the panels if there is any adjustment that has to be made. And I'm pretty sure that there's going to be a lot. Now whenever you're adjusting gaps, you want to start at the one closest to the rear of the car because all these up here are adjustable, but if you started from the front and worked your way back and the one here at the rear was too wide, well, can't really scoot the quarter forward. Whenever you're adjusting a door, you have a couple of ways you can do it at the hinge. If you loosen the 3 bolts here on the cowl, you can slide the door forwards and rear, and you can also lift it up or down. Here on the door itself, if you loosen the 3 bolts that attach the hinge, well, you can lift the door also, but you can also lean the door in or out, depending on what you need. But first things first, we've got to get the door hung to see exactly where we're at.
3/8 bolts are what hold the door to the car, and that's a pretty common size for body panels. We're not going to tighten them down very much just yet in order to leave room for adjustment.
Now, all hinges aren't created equal. Now, on some of your older stuff, you'd have to use what's called a shim to kind of adjust it however you need it. And then whenever you get into that later model stuff, well, the hinge is actually welded in a fixed location, and you have to bend the door just to make the adjustment, and it can be a bear. Now, there's several different things you have to consider whenever you're adjusting the door. There's the edge here from the rocker to the bottom of the door, the height of the door to the quarter, and the gap of the door itself. Now, oftentimes people use this highly calibrated tool. It's a paint paddle. It'll give you a measurement of a perfect 1/8 inch gap. You can just simply slide it down here, find out where it's tight, and then make your adjustment. Now, looking here at the door, you can see that this part of the door is actually bent up just a bit, and this part of the door is bent down. We're going to have to straighten that out first. Now, since this is such an obvious problem, you can use a paint paddle and lay it right across the edge of the door and see how it's nice and straight till you slide it to about that last 1/2 inch of the door. We need to go ahead and dress it before, well, we start messing with the door gap. A body hammer and a dolly are the tools of choice for this fix. I'll keep using my paddle as a straight edge reference while I move the metal. The pick end of the hammer will help alleviate the spot where the metal is trying to bunch up. The old filler will take care of the rest. That ought to work.
Still ahead, just because the metal is crooked doesn't make it a lost cause. Coming up, we'll modify the gaps to straighten out the lines. Also see what the iconic Olds 442 looked like when it was pristine.
Okay, we're going to see if we can get this door dialed in, and with so much going on back there, up here, and down on the rocker panel for clearance, well, it's a two-man job, definitely.
That's it, buddy. Now, all of these gaps kind of play together, so you have to adjust them accordingly. We're using this paint paddle to set the distance between the top of the rocker and the bottom of the door. And you can lift it up or push it down however you need to, but we're just pushing it just flush. And then we've got to adjust this one back here. Well, you can tell that our gap is pretty inconsistent. Down here at the bottom, it's a little bit loose, but as you travel up, well, it gets a little more and a little more. And then actually it gets too tight from here to about right there. And then as you go back toward the top, well, it actually gets loose again. So what we need to do is open this side up, because that's just the happy medium of where the door needs to be located. If we scooted the door forward to compensate for the gap where it's too tight here, well, the rest of it would be way too wide and it'd be just more work.
Looks good here.
Go ahead and snug her down, Joe. Our first point of attack is right here on this door edge where it's a little bit shy. What we're going to do is take a pencil, mark the top and bottom of it, grind off the primer, and then using this electric caulk gun, we're going to fill in the inconsistency, grind it down, and we'll be ready to go. You don't want to put filler right here on the edge of this door, because if it was to bump into something just slightly, it'd chip off and then it'd be in a heck of a mess. Now, the two outer ones is pretty much where it all starts, but these two inner ones, that's where it's really bad from there in. That just gives me an indication of where I really gonna have to concentrate the filler.
The primer needs to be scuffed off first with a scuffing wheel. Then, well, it might take a few tries and adjustments to the welder before you get it dialed in correctly, but once you do, you'll be all right.
Every once in a while, if you use an air blower to cool off the panel, it will help prevent warping. After we lay enough weld in there to add the extra metal we need, a grinder will do the job of smoothing it back out to a straight edge. It may take a few passes to get it as smooth as it needs to be. Just take your time and be patient. You can see what it looked like before and what it looks like now. All right, with that part of the door taken care of, we're going to move to where it's tight up here at the top. At first glance, well, I thought it was the shape of the door. And really, what it wound up being is whenever we put that quarter on, well, it kind of relaxed a bit and it tightened up the door gap. That's no biggie. We'll just have to massage it a bit, fix it as well. Don't just wail away with the hammer. It takes light taps to move the metal over where it needs to be. Sometimes a body hammer won't move it far enough. We'll show you in a second how to fix that with a relief cut. Now, depending on how much you need to open up that gap is going to determine whether or not you need to make the slice and do a relief cut. With ours, it really wasn't all that tight, so a few taps of the hammer made the adjustment just fine. And you need to be careful whenever you do something like that with the hammer, because that metal you're moving, well, it's got to go somewhere. And if you're not too careful, it'll cause this quarter to kind of bow up, and then you've got to come back and fix that. The next part of our door gap problem, well, this one here is a little bit wide, as you can see. So you could take and cram a little filler in this edge and kind of extend up the quarter to tighten it up a bit. What I'm going to do is slice this quarter here and kind of bend that lip forward to tighten up the gap, and then weld it up, grind it up, we'll be ready to go. And whenever you're making a relief cut like this one, you have to go past the point of where you just need to adjust. This way it allows you to blend it in nice.
A little bit of welding on the outer edge will hold it in place, but allow the inner bit to still move. While the gap is reduced, we can weld up the relief cut. The door gap still looks like it's a little too big, so some additional welding out on the gap should do the job of filling it in as much as we need. We'll keep adding in metal and grinding it back until we get the gap the way we want it.
There you go. This gap looks tremendously better. That old big wide spot, well, we tightened it up, compensate for it. And this tight spot up here, paint paddle slides right through. And then this giant, huge gap that what it had before, well, it's gone bye-bye.
Stick around and grab a gander at one of the most iconic Oldsmobile offerings to ever rearrange a section of pavement. Then we'll wrap up our panel pounding gap tech. Detroit Muscle salutes the Olds 442.
If you wanted a really fast car back in the 60s and didn't want anyone to know about it, then the Olds 442 had your name on it.
There's a lot of people that see the car at a show or see it on the street and think it's just a plain vanilla 442. They don't really know what lurks underneath the hood, you know?
It's what the kids wanted back then. Pontiac had unexpected success with the GTO. Those three letters spelled trouble for any takers.
But Oldsmobile had three numbers, 442, 4-barrel carb, 4 on the floor, and dual exhaust, high horsepower and even higher torque, all in a plain Jane wrapper. Olds started with a mid-size Cutlass platform and added a retuned Rocket 330 V8. They called it the B09 Police Apprehender Pursuit Package. And if it was good enough for the cops, well, yeah, you get the picture.
The 442 was available in all but the Cutlass station wagon and came with bucket seats and a tachometer. The only exterior giveaway was the small badge on the deck lid and side.
A few changes in '66 included a boost to 400 cubic inch with the W30 engine package. It included 2 secret air scoops inside the front bumper that led to the dual intake tubes feeding the air cleaner. Fuel was delivered through a unique triple 2-barrel Rochester carb setup called the L69. Progressive linkage tied all three together and prevented any lag time in the outer 2 carbs. John Keneally bought his back in the 80s and did a top-to-bottom resto. Only 54 W30s were made in '66, which makes his ultra rare.
It's the pinnacle of Olds performance. If my memory serves me correct, there's 16 surviving cars. Number one, it had tri-power, the L69 tri-power setup on it, which was a mechanical setup as opposed to a progressive setup like the GTO, so it operated a little bit better. Had the ram air induction, as you can see, with the scoops under the bumper. Had the 411 gear set in the back, M21 transmission. A little stiffer valve springs, a little hotter cam. W30s were blueprinted. The lower end of the motor was sort of select fit, you know, more set for drag racing.
And the numbers proved formidable. 0 to 60 in 6.3 seconds. And quarter-mile ETs in the 15 range. Not bad for stock.
67 through 70, the engines got bigger despite the looming oil crisis, and Olds aggressively marketed the brand. And don't forget, in 68, the Hurst Olds rolled out with a potent 455-inch V8, setting the Olds offerings even higher in the muscle car wars. Even so, the rare W30s are still a highly sought-after option.
This car is pretty rare because it is only one of 121 W30 convertibles made in 1969. And out of the 121, only 91 of them had 4 speeds. There's no bigger thrill than getting behind the wheel, putting the top down, and jamming some gears.
GM killed off Oldsmobile 10 years ago, but these classic 442s will live on as bare bones muscle with class. Coming up, more on our Hurst Olds tribute car and how to reduce wind noise with a perfect panel. We're back to wrap up our door and fender tweaks. We got our radiator support and fenders all in place, so time to make some final adjustments.
Yeah, fender gap has a couple different requirements. Not only do you want it to look good, but you've got to have just enough clearance in it so that the door can open and close properly.
Have you ever known anybody to put so much primer and paint on one of these things that it tightens the gap up too much?
Oh yeah, that's a pretty common problem. So oftentimes if guys body work the panel separate, well, they'll put the car together one last time right before they put on some paint, because once that thing's shiny, well, you're kind of married to the gaps.
Fender fitment can also affect the quietness of your ride. If the door is sticking out further than the fender, it's going to catch air and you're going to hear it.
So what you want to do is have the fender out at least flush or just a little bit more so that it doesn't catch any air.
Well, now we can detect a little bit of a flat spot here on the door, which needs to be corrected to follow the contour of the fender. A few taps with the slide hammer ought to handle that. Slide hammers usually have several attachments like this hook. You don't want to get too excited with this thing. Do a few pulls, check the panel, then do a few more pulls, then check the panel and repeat until it's just right. We only moved it about 1/16 of an inch, but that's all it needed.
Well, now we're ready to move on to putting our hood on, but before we can do that, we're going to remove these hood springs off of the hinges itself. The reason being is when we made this cool custom firewall, well, the back side of the fender support, well, we had to cut off the tab. So if we tried to do it now, it just bend under. We don't want to mess up anything. So we got a cool little trick to show you.
Simply attach the hook end of a ratchet strap and pull the spring off the hinge. We grabbed Ryan from Truck Tech to help us get the hood on the car. This thing is heavy. And this will be the last panel that needs to be gapped.
A hood is pretty straightforward. You guys have seen us adjust them 1,000 times by simply loosening the 2 bolts that mount it to the hinge and slide it forward or back to get it just perfect. And then you've got the little bitty adjuster up front that you can screw to get it just right on the top of the fender.
Of course, you got to obsess more about gaps with a car that's going to be painted white like the Oldsmobile, because those gaps are going to show up more. With a black car, there's more margin for error because the gaps aren't that noticeable. Of course, dirt is with a black car, so I guess, Tommy, there's always a trade-off.
Well, that pretty much wraps us up for another Detroit Muscles. Thank you guys for watching. Joe, I think the Oldsmobile looks pretty sweet.
I think we ought to go out and have some supper and celebrate. You ever had mountain oysters?
Well, there was this one time. It was long ago, but I don't want to talk about it.